next conversation I'm very much excited for between Kate Gordon and Bharat Ramamurti. Per our tradition, I'll say a few words about Kate and then allow her to introduce Bharat. So Kate is the CEO of California Forward, which is an organization dedicated to regional economic development in California. She spent the last 2 decades working on climate change, energy policy, and issues around equitable economic development. She was recently a senior advisor to the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm. So thank you, Kate, for leading this discussion.
Thank you.
I'm really excited about this conversation also, so thank you so much to CEPR for inviting me and us. And Bharat Ramamurti, who's here next to me, has a very long resume. I will just say a couple things about it that are relevant. One is, most probably recent, just served as Deputy Director at the National Economic Council and Advisor for Strategic Economic Communications in the Biden-Harris administration. So we were fortunate to serve in that administration together. It's great to be back together. And then before joining that administration, Bharat was appointed as a member of the Congressional Oversight Commission for the CARES Act by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, where he helped oversee $500 billion in government spending, which is very related to my first question to you, which is, it strikes me that a lot of the policy folks that we've been hearing from when it comes to the abundance agenda and talking about today are legislators. You and I have both been in the executive branch. That is where most of the actual implementation happens. Can you just talk about, given your work doing that, overseeing these trillions of dollars, trying to move programs from theory to implementation, what's your take? Broad question. What's your take on the abundance agenda? Do the book's recommendations on how we should start building things again resonate with you as a federal policymaker?
Yes, they do, and thank you all for having me. The phrase that keeps rattling around in my head as I listened to the book and then read some of the articles that have come out around it is abundance leaves me wanting more, in both senses of the term. So it leaves me wanting more in the sense that I share the author's goals and the movement's goals of more clean energy, more housing, more high-speed rail, more affordable transit. All of these are really important government goals, societal goals, and it's clear that we have work to do to accomplish them. But I think that there's also a sense, as I finished the book and read the articles, of wanting a little bit more from the authors and maybe coming out of this conference about what types of trade-offs we should be willing to live with in order to achieve those goals. And the reason I say that is because other previous speakers today have talked about kind of a crust over our policymaking process that slows things down. And I will be the first to admit that there are some low-hanging fruit that we should get rid of that are purely time-wasting. They serve no purpose other than slowing things down. There are processes that do nothing other than make us go more slowly. They don't improve the quality of the outcome. And I'm all aboard for trying to get rid of those. But I think very, very quickly, you get to some very challenging trade-offs. And my question for abundance folks is, how should we think through those types of trade-offs? And so 2 examples from having listened to the book. There's a section on construction costs as a driver of overall cost for all of these different types of projects. And the book quotes at length from somebody in the construction industry who says, the number one driver of higher costs for me now compared to 30 years ago is worker safety requirements. I have to spend all this time and energy creating safe walkways across my construction site. I have to allow workers to do calisthenics for 15 minutes in the morning and bring people in because that's a requirement that's mandated. I have to make sure that everyone's got the proper safety equipment, and that's driven up by my costs, right? And then the book just leaves it there. Okay? It doesn't say, and therefore we should get rid of those worker safety requirements or roll them back, right? And so, the question that I was left with is, what level of increased risk to worker safety should we be willing to live with, if any, in order to build more quickly or build more cheaply, right? And does your answer depend if your job involves just sitting at a desk all day writing articles, or if you are the one who's doing the construction project, or it's your kid who's doing the construction project, right? Same thing in the section about affordable housing. they were saying that one reason why private projects were much less expensive than government-funded projects was because the government-funded projects all required payment of a prevailing wage. And again, they didn't, and the authors didn't say, and therefore we should get rid of prevailing wage requirements. But that was certainly the implication of that section. And again, so should we be willing to get rid of prevailing wage requirements and other types of labor protections in order to drive down the cost of housing construction? If so, which one should we get rid of and how? And that, to me, ultimately brings up the core challenge for abundance for me, which is that I view it as not an end in and of itself. It is a means to an end, right? If there's plenty of a world in which we have abundant energy and housing, but the air is not breathable, and children at the age of 14 are working because that means that we can build housing more quickly, and have we achieved a society that we want? I would assume most of the authors would say we haven't. So how do we think through the right level of trade-off that we should be willing to live with in order to achieve these goals? Once we get past, again, as I said, that initial layer of things that are basically no regrets.
It's such a great point, and I'm really glad you pointed to those two examples. It's making me think, the reason that we have labor unions and a lot of those safety rules is because in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, everybody was getting killed. I mean, for those who have read Sinclair Lewis, right, remember The Jungle and the person falls into the vat or whatever, that's why unions started, people started collective bargaining, people started fighting back, people started trying to build wages and safety into the system. So great point is sort of like, where is that level of kind of basic protection of human quality of life and then an ability to get people who are skilled to do these jobs, and then where do you go above that? And how do you sort of sort through those layers? It's reminding me, I just finished reading, for those who have read the great book, I think, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. He just wrote a new book, Meditation for Mortals, and he says in it, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs.
Yep.
And I actually think it's sort of a good way to think about this.
Yes.
It is messy and complicated.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And the other major point that I would make is that there is, in my mind, not enough at the moment engagement with the role of corporations and corporate financial incentives and all of this. In all of these different categories, we are not just talking about the government, other than the government building public housing or something like that. A lot of these we're talking about an interaction between government programs, government funding, government regulation, and a set of private entities who are profit maximizing corporations, right? And in many instances, profit maximization by corporations does not mean supply maximization. In fact, more often than not, those two things are at odds with each other. And so when people point to, why is a country like China so fast at building things? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is that the government there can just tell a corporation or a set of corporations, keep building that stuff, even though you're going well past the point of profitability. It's a priority of ours to build more solar panels than anybody on the planet, so keep building them, even though if you had restricted supply, you would be more profitable as an entity. Here in the United States, we tend to be unwilling to have that level of market intervention. So again, another key trade-off I think that the folks on the abundance movement have to think about is what level of market intervention and overriding the basic financial incentives of the private sector are you willing to live with in order to achieve these outcomes?
Super interesting example, and just thinking about China, also the relationship between government and business is very, very, very close in general. And it does strike me, and it's been striking me as we've been listening today, many of the things that we're sort of are adding the layers, and I am the first to say they add layers that create delay and are not always necessary, but a lot of the things that add the layers are government trying to protect itself from the risk of having to pay for something in the long term, right? So if I add a layer of like making something be at highest standards of climate resilience when I first build it, that's because I, the government, am actually the person who has to pay for all of it if it falls apart. I have to pay for the disaster response, I have to pay for unemployment, I have to pay for relocation, I have to pay for rebuilding. If I'm the company who has 18 months of developer interest and risk in that property, I don't have to pay for any of that stuff. Yep. So some of it is just balancing, right?
Completely, yeah, and I think I'm more used to, I've been worked at the federal level, so I have less familiarity with the state level. I would say based on my reading, I would say that at the state level, there are a lot of good examples of processes that are largely time-wasting and can be eliminated with relatively little regrets. And at the federal level, my experience has been that the barriers to quick government action tend to come in two ways. Number one, there is, as you said, an overriding concern, and often more from Republicans than from Democrats, about avoiding wasteful spending, right? And I think that you see that in means testing government services programs, but you also see it, for example, in the broadband program. This has been kind of an example that folks in the abundance movement have been talking a lot about, and Ezra Klein talked about it with Jon Stewart. There was a very lengthy process that was put in place for actually spending the $42 billion that Congress had allocated to make sure that we connected every household in the United States to high-speed internet. And Ezra, in that conversation, used that as an example of the sort of procedure fetish, as we talked about, of Democrats. But as somebody who was involved in those negotiations, it was actually Democrats who came in and said, let's just do an auction via the FCC and then allocate, and it's a very sort of the economist's dream way of allocating to the lowest cost provider and then have the money go out to the companies that want to do it. And it was Republicans in those negotiations who came in and said, no, we want to make sure that every state has an opportunity to come up with a plan, and we really want to make sure that we are not spending any federal dollars anywhere where there's already a company that's providing any service. And so we need to make sure that there's a very lengthy challenge process, both at the federal and the state level, of any maps and any plans to make sure that an AT&T or a Comcast can come in and say, actually, we're already planning on serving that area, so don't allocate any funding to there. And that's a big part of the reason why we have this lengthy process. So again, I think I'm not casting aspersions on that as a goal. I think it's really important that we spend money efficiently, but I think it gets to the point of efficiency can mean speed.
Yeah.
Efficiency can mean minimizing waste. Those two things are often at odds with each other. And when you talk about more government efficiency, which one do you want more of?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I know you and I have talked about, just in general, your feeling that the book works better at a local and state level than it does at a federal level, just based on your experience. Say a little bit more about sort of that, but also where do you think at the federal level there are opportunities for, if you're thinking about that crust or those layers of bureaucracy or those layers of regulation, where do you think there's room for efficiency there at the federal level?
Again, I'm more familiar with the federal level, but I think particularly here in California, I think there is unequivocally a set of processes on environmental rules and the ways that those are being challenged and used to slow down projects that are probably we can address. I think that exclusionary zoning at the local level is something that we can try to address. It's primarily a local issue. At the federal level, again, my experience has been that the number one thing that slows progress down is what's called the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a law that was passed a few decades ago that governs agency action, and it basically requires agencies to, if they're doing something relatively major, to put out a proposed rule, to get comments back, to incorporate those comments or address them somehow in a final rule. And then at that point, there's a legal challenge that people can bring to that rule. And it really slows things down in two ways. First of all, that notice and comment process can often take 1 to 3 years to be done properly. And again, general counsels of agencies are sitting there worried, petrified about the thought of being sued at the end of this, so they want to make sure that they are doing things very methodically so that they can then go to court and talk about all the steps that they did. The second really big thing about the Administrative Procedures Act, which interacts with the legal concept of standing, is that if you want to challenge something in court, if you want to say a rule did something poorly, you have to show that you were harmed by that rule, right, in order to have standing in court. Well, what ends up happening is that, by and large, corporate interest, industry, can say, oh, this regulatory requirement on this thing or that thing injured me in some way, and so they're able to bring something into court and then say, that's why the rule went too far. There's no counterbalance to say, this rule, I should have been protected by this rule, and I didn't get that protection from that, and I'm suing because of that. And again, that creates this kind of risk aversion that permeates the federal government, and I can't tell you how many conversations I would have with folks at agencies in the general counsel's office who are just doing their jobs, to be clear, but saying, if we do things this way, it exposes us to a higher risk of a lawsuit. Let's cut this back. Let's try to go more slowly. Let's do another round of comments to make sure that, and all of that slows things down. And the other big thing I would say is that there's a big role for Congress here, because the amazing thing that I discovered when I started working on Capitol Hill in 2013 for Senator Warren was that if you put a deadline into a statute and then the agency doesn't meet the deadline, nothing happens.
That's right. That's true.
It's amazing. Like Dodd-Frank passed in 2010, and it changed financial rules, and it told all these agencies to write rules by 2011, 2012. There are still rules that have not been completed that are 13 years overdue at this point, and there's nothing that Congress can't go to court and sue and say, why didn't you do these rules? People, again, it goes back to that point, people who would have benefited from that rule passing can't go to court and say, why didn't you pass this rule, enact this rule in time? And so my recommendation for Congress would be put actual teeth into your statute about what happens if you don't meet this requirement, these deadlines. So if you say, we want to do a broadband funding program, and if we're doing it, passing it now in 2025, if by 2026 states have not received this money, the money goes from the agency that it was allocated to initially to another agency, right?
Clawbacks, basically.
Either clawback or just, you embarrass an agency by saying you don't get that money. And the one thing that agencies love is to having money to administer programs, right? So, Commerce, you had the authority to do this. You didn't meet your deadline. This money automatically goes to the FCC, right? So there's ways of building in accountability and speed into these programs that I think could be valuable.
No, it's a great point, and I think some states have done that pretty effectively. They've done, like incentive programs with clawbacks, which is interesting. How would you deal with the APA? The thing you just raised that I think is underlying the whole conversation today, which is this risk aversion from government, and I totally agree with you that it gets more so the higher level you go, partly because you have way more people withstanding to do things, and partly because the stakes are really high. How do you reduce that risk aversion given, do you do immunity? Do you just throw out the ability to do laws? I mean, how do you reduce the risk aversion while not defaulting to Robert Moses 2.0, right? I mean, if that's not what we want.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the good things about the abundance moment, or whatever you want to call it, is that it is putting the spotlight on actual performance. I think the thing that a lot of people, and again, I think for good reason, a lot of people in government are, the downside risk of something going poorly is much worse than the upside benefit of doing something well and on time, right? And again, that's because if you do something poorly, you could get fired. Your name could be in the newspaper about how you did a terrible job. You're going to get your agency sued, right? There's all these bad things that happened. Whereas if you just don't do anything, most people can just kind of float along and nothing really happens as a result of that. And so creating more political reward and public reward for doing things quickly and on time and creatively, I think is an important counterbalance to all of that. But I think at the end of the day, you also need to correct some of the legal incentives via the APA. So for example, you could expand standing and say that, number one, if an agency misses a deadline in a statute, somebody can sue and say that you need to, abide by this deadline, and then the court could have an injunction that says, okay, you have to do this within 90 days now, right? Otherwise, there's actual individual accountability for failing to do that, right? You could expand the APA and say that it's not just people who were harmed because the rule did something directly to injure them, but also people who can claim that they would have been benefited by a rule. For example, if the proposed rule said it was going to cover you and the final rule doesn't, let's make sure that those people can bring a lawsuit in court and they have standing. Now it's complicated because standing is a constitutional doctrine and you have to figure out a way of making that work. But the point is, every human being responds to incentives. And the incentives right now, again, my familiarity is at the federal level. At the federal level, the incentives right now are almost always in favor of going smaller or not moving at all versus going bigger and going quickly.
Well, it's interesting you bring up this sort of question of the standing of those who would have otherwise benefited, which is interesting and making me think about some of the housing conversations we've been having here about, who is able to come to the community meetings are people, not the people who don't live in the community today, but could maybe if there were housing. A lot of the abundance movement discussion that I find really compelling is in the housing space, and I know we're going to have a whole panel on that. I'm interested in how you think about it when it comes to things that are not housing, and particularly big industrial projects. We talked on the earlier panel, Varsha was talking about the need for this kind of wholesale transition of the entire energy system. Mm-hmm. That's a ton of infrastructure, it's a ton of industry, you're building up a bunch of new industry, it's a bunch of transmission lines, it's just a lot. And I'm just interested in how we think about that with this movement, in part because in listening to, I'm a big listener of Ezra Khan's podcast, and he's fairly down on the idea that was definitely a Biden administration idea that we should be trying to really push for domestic manufacturing. He's sort of like cast a lot of doubt on, does that really create good jobs? Does it really, improve local economies significantly? I think we could argue about that. But I guess I'm wondering is getting to speed and scale, which like the whole Doerr school here was founded on that idea from John Doerr. So speed and scale in the energy system. Does that mean we don't do domestic content because it's just hard because you're doing project after project after project where people actually might be there in the community and be fence line communities and sue you,
Right.
Yeah. Or do we do it by reducing a bunch of that regulation, to your earlier point? Do you get rid of all that stuff that allows them to do that today, including the democratic process? Or do you do it all overseas, which is sort of how we got solar to be cheap, just to be honest?
Right. Well, I think, again, it goes back to the point I made in the first question, which is if you view abundance as a means to an end, what is the goal that we are trying to accomplish here ultimately, right? Because if we are purely interested in getting a lot of stuff here that is as cheap as possible, then of course domestic content requirements are not the way to go in the short term, right? We had some concerns about importing solar panels from China because there was evidence that they were employing Uyghurs as forced labor in order to build those solar panels. But they were really cheap. And it's important for our climate goals. Should we be supporting that industry by importing Chinese solar panels, right? Like right now, as people have mentioned today, there is. BYD is producing really low-cost EVs, right? Do we want to import those wholesale? Because again, that's consistent with our climate goals, but what will that do to the US manufacturing sector? And again, in our long-term interest in having a thriving auto manufacturing sector in the United States. As you said, everything is trade-offs, right? And unless we have a clear sense of how we are trying to balance these interests, are we willing to live with supporting human rights violations in order to have more and cheaper goods? I would imagine a lot of people in this room would say no. Okay. Are we willing to live with the fact that we won't have a domestic auto industry which employs lots of people in the United States? I imagine more people in this room would be willing to say yes, but a lot of people would be willing to say no. So I think these are the really hard trade-offs. And to the extent that abundance is trying to say, we have put too little emphasis on building quickly and efficiently, I agree with that, right? And I wholeheartedly support the idea that that the pendulum may have swung too far towards de-emphasizing that. But again, as I said, I think you very quickly start to hit really hard trade-offs on other goals that we have as a society and as a government. And I think the next stage of abundance, to the extent there is one, is articulating a set of policy ideas and honestly sort of moral and political standards for thinking through those trade-offs in a constructive way.
Yeah, it's a really important, I think, these levels of trade-off are really interesting because just thinking about your auto industry point, if we lose the auto industry in the United States, it has very specific impacts on specific places for sure, but also there's a reason we bailed it out in the financial crisis, and that's because it underpins U.S. manufacturing in a really significant way, which underpins the debt market in a significant way, which underpins our financial system in a significant way. So these things are all the things you have to think about if you're working at the federal level and thinking about what those trade-offs are. And then at the local level, you're like, I think someone said earlier, if the one thing in your town that creates the entire tax base and all the jobs is your one auto factory, and it goes away, that has significant impacts. Yep. To that place, and also knock-on effects of like having to bail out that place, which is expensive. It's interesting to think about the solar thing also. I'll just, from my own experience, I did a lot of the work at the Department of Energy in trying to roll out the infrastructure bill and IRA programs around the country. And I will tell you just personally, we ran into opposition in places because of what people felt like was a failed promise from the solar industry investments 10 years earlier. People would say to us, you promised us a bunch of green jobs. Back then, all we got were short-term, temporary installation jobs, and then they only lasted as long as the American Rescue and Reinvestment Act, which is only 2 years. And so you're telling us again, there's going to be a bunch of jobs, we're going to see a bunch of economic activity, we just don't believe you.
Right.
So that like lack of trust in that one microcosm, I think, is really important to think about as we're thinking about how do we roll out an abundance movement or culture or agenda that deals with historic distrust, whether it's distrust from highways being built through communities or it's distrust from the green jobs bill of goods? How do we deal with that in these processes? And I'm super interested in your thoughts on this. Somebody brought it up on the earlier conversation, but what's the role of democratic process in all of this?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that I would certainly agree, and I imagine most people would agree, that the town meeting approach to democratic input is pretty flawed because people can't show up at 7 o'clock on a weekday, people with kids can't do it, people who are working the night shift can't do it, and you end up getting a very slanted view of what the public's opinion is on a particular issue. You know, to me, the answer isn't, I think Derek said this earlier, the answer isn't let's stop having public input on ideas. It's let's use technology, let's use some of the other tools in the toolbox to make sure that we're getting a more representative view of what people want. I mean, ultimately, if you look at the data, there has been a huge decline in trust in government from, you know, some used to be about 80% of people had trust the government would do the right thing in the late 1960s. It's now at about 20%, right? And a lot of that was sort of Watergate era, but it's been pretty low for a very long time now. And again, there's been good research showing that people feel like the government isn't listening to them. And when people do feel empowered and do feel listened to, trust in government goes up quite significantly. So I think in many ways, the core challenge, not just for abundance, but for any political movement, is to figure out how do you make sure that whatever the goals are of your movement, how do you make sure that people feel like their ideas and are being reflected in that? And you know, again, I think housing is is a tough nut to crack in the sense that, you know, at the federal level, I think that there is, you know, at least among the Democratic Party, if you know, the left and the center, a real unanimous support for zoning reform at the federal level. You know, I wanted to read this because I worked as an economic advisor to Senator Warren for 7 years, obviously on the left wing of the party. And in 2018, before abundance was cool, you know, we did a big housing bill, you know, which was kind of a landmark bill at the time. And it included a big pot of money, so big federal investments to build more housing across the country, 3 million new units, but also what I thought was a pretty innovative new race to the top program for zoning, where basically we would put $50 billion of federal money aside and say that any state and local area that changed zoning requirements to make it easier to build housing could show us the plan. Yeah. And if you won, if we agreed that was a good plan, you would get some of this money. And then you could use that money either to do the affordable housing or to go do some of the work that goes along with it to sort of help people swallow that pill in the form of, let's build more parks, let's build more roads with this federal dollars. And this was the quote that she put out in her press release at the time, which I mean could have come directly from Ezra Klein's mouth, right? This proposal will attack the rising cost of housing by helping to roll back needlessly restrictive local zoning rules and taking down other barriers that keep American families from living in neighborhoods with good jobs and good schools. Okay, so you know, and Bernie Sanders in his 2020 campaign platform had a zoning reform proposal.
Yeah, I remember.
Right? So this isn't something that's that controversial among the left at the federal level. Yeah. I think that once you go down to the state and local level, however, and you talk to legislators and mayors and city council members and so on, what you find is to the extent that even if they are very supportive of reforms to make it easier to build housing, the people that they represent often are not. You know, and I know these are sort of shorthanded as NIMBYs, but I think that there are a lot of people who are probably okay with the idea in the abstract, but are concerned about overcrowding in schools and the park and, you know, more traffic and will there be swings available at the park?
And they're their neighbors and stuff,
yeah.
I mean, right? Like and they actually know the mayor.
Right, you know, and that's the core thing about housing, right? It is in many ways the beneficiaries of more housing, at least, you know, the first level beneficiaries of more housing in a community are often people who don't live in that community, right? And so it can be a hard thing politically to sell to people. And I think, again, the question is how do you overcome those types of, you know, very real political concerns in order to accomplish what I think is a really important outcome for the country, which is a lot more housing?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was in Governor Newsom's administration running the Office of Planning and Research, we did a lot of the general plans I spent a lot of time thinking about CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And it was funny, we'd go out into cities and people would pull me aside all the time and say, we need you to tell us to do this thing because we can't say it. because people get mad at us, but we need to throw the state under the bus and say, well, the state told us to do this thing, which I think is fine. I mean, we would listen to that, obviously. There's a role for that. And I'm sort of, I'm stuck on this democracy question. Like, is that the right answer? I mean, a lot of what we're talking about feels like it's centralization of power, actually, right? We're talking about centralizing power to streamline things. We're talking about coordinating at a more central level. We're talking, I mean, and is that, and then of course that's what China does, which is the example everyone almost points to. It's a very centralized power. How do we think about that in a representative democracy?
It is hard. Yeah, I agree with that because you want to strike this balance because look, you can say at a very broad level there are elections every 2 years and that's your opportunity to weigh in on people's policy priorities. Obviously, you don't get to have that's not specific enough. You're dealing with a whole array of issues when you're making your vote. You're making your voting decision. The other end of the extreme is if we're going to do a project, the people should be involved in providing input on each and every individual decision in how that project works. That also seems impractical, right? So the question is, what is that middle ground where people feel like, broadly speaking, I was listened to, my interests were reflected in this, and I think a lot of it is, can you buy people into the goal, the overall goal of the project, with the understanding of what trade-offs are involved in accomplishing that goal. I really think that's important, right? Like, if you look back at some of the great things that America has done, the Manhattan Project, Apollo, there were lofty goals, and I think that there was a robust discussion of what the trade-offs were going to be, right? Like, I remember there was big critiques of the Apollo program because they're like, why are you spending money sending people to space when people are starving in the streets and people are homeless? Like, this is ridiculous. But that democratic process, I think, ultimately led to a belief that this was net beneficial for the country, and that gave people operating with that program some flexibility within that to then say, this is the most efficient and best way of getting this accomplished most quickly.
No, it's a great point. I mean, in a lot of the post-World War II, or the during and post-World War II programs were under the guise of a larger agenda, right? So it's a great point. It's interesting, and it came up on an earlier panel. We'll go to questions in a second, but one interesting thing that I think is giving people some optimism is this idea of creating like zones, or like in Contra Costa, there's a green empowerment zone process happening where there's a refinery closure and everyone's coming together, labor, community, business, the refiners are coming together to have a conversation about what criteria do we want to see whatever's next on this site meet, and then the next step is like, can we actually set a set of criteria, which then we have the legal authority to streamline permitting if we get to it. It's an interesting combination of democratic process meets streamlining, which I think is quite interesting. And there's a lot of evidence that the more community input you do ahead of time, the less litigation risk you have later. So it actually does achieve some of the abundance goals to do that if you do it well. So it's just an interesting example.
Completely, yeah. And I think about one of the things that I was working on when I was in the White House was on delivering small business relief. And what we had a process in place to make sure that if people were applying for relief, basically to keep their small business or restaurant, in this case, open, that they were meeting certain requirements for having seen a loss of business, and that they were going to use the money for payroll and all of these other things, and they submit a lot of information in order to qualify for it. Well, what we discovered was that if we worked with some of the sort of point of sale technology that a lot of these restaurants use, right? These, the thing that they spin around so that you type in the tip.
The square thing.
A lot of the information about their sales, about their historical performance over time was all already there. And so we worked with that company to basically get that information directly from them, and we dramatically streamlined the ability of our ability to get money out to these restaurants much more quickly and with less fraud, because we had verified financial statement, financial information from this company. So, there are ways where you can achieve these win-wins. I think using technology to both reduce fraud and increase efficiency. And look, I think that but even that change was a heavy lift because it represented somewhat of a deviation from what had already been done, what Congress seemed to be okay with, right? That's the other thing. There's oversight risk, right? I didn't mention that. Not just your name can be in the newspaper, but you can be hauled before Congress in front of a hostile committee and subjected to, a lot of questioning about why you screwed something up and wasted money. So again, all of that leads to people wanting to sort of go with what's been established as okay and not take any risk. And I think trying to get that balance right is important. I think one of the best parts of the book was talking about Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania. He did this project. He took some risks. But he did it with union labor. He got a lot of buy-in from the community, and then ultimately he delivered something that worked and it was on time, and he reaped a political reward for it, right? And I think that that's the kind of model that we can have going forward for rewarding public servants for this type of outcome.
Yeah, no, it's a great example, yeah, super good example. I want to take a couple questions. So if anybody has questions for Bharat, or in general, we've talked about a lot of things back here. Yep.
I particularly appreciated you talking about the trade-offs and even the trade-offs of abundance, and something that, sorry, my name is Isabella Chu. I'm with the Center for Population Health Sciences, and I'm also a local elected. Something I've been thinking a lot about is there's arguably two areas where we've achieved abundance. One is food supply. The other is automobiles, that we have displaced walking at the population level. And both of those things have actually made population health worse. And so something I've been thinking a lot about is how do we measure whether or not we're getting the trade-offs and the dose of a particular thing right? And as a pop health person, I would measure probably, life expectancy or survival till 70. But I'd love to hear from you how we think about measuring the dose, how we know if we're getting it right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and it keeps coming back to this point, which I think is the fundamental question of politics and government and society, which is what are the goals that we have, and what is necessary to achieve them, and what sacrifices are we willing to make in order to achieve them. You're right. I mean, that's the other thing is that if there are levels of abundance of all of these things, right? Obviously, there's an expression, too much of a good thing, right? And obviously, we need, compared to today, we definitely need more housing. We definitely need more clean energy. Those seem like non-negotiable things that we need. But do we hit a point where we have so much of it that we are doing harm to the economy, harm to society? Potentially, it's harder for me to imagine some of those things, but when it comes to housing and energy, than compared to the food, as you noted. But I just think that there is, it keeps coming back to the trade-offs point, because I think that when we were doing policymaking in the Biden administration, we spent a lot of time thinking through the trade-offs of a lot of these things. And during that time, it was almost all about inflation, right? Should we keep these tariffs on China? Well, they do marginally drive up the cost of goods. So we want to live with that, or do we not, compared to the national security and economic goals that we have with that, right? Do we want to provide direct relief to people, in the form of a gas card to offset the cost of gas? Well, it would be good for the people who receive it, but maybe it would create upward pressure on prices broadly across the economy because there's more money to spend. Do we want to live with that or not, right? So all policymaking is trade-offs. And again, I think that the main attraction of abundance for me is that it is emphasizing that, faster, more efficient building should be something that we prioritize more. And that is something I agree with. But to your point, there's obviously, we get to a level at which that shouldn't be a priority anymore in a particular industry or a particular sector, and we need to be careful about where that is.
And in California, on the housing side, there are very specific trade-offs, because you can build a lot more housing more quickly if you build giant development projects in high-risk fire areas, which have open land. But the downside of that is potential. They can't be insured, they burn down, you have bankruptcy in the municipality because of costs of that. There are a lot of things that go into that decision. So just your point is an important one, thinking about that. But there's answers to that, right? You can talk about the trade-offs honestly and upfront, and then talk about what the answers are to try to deal with some of them, instead of, I think, hiding all of that in the black box of bureaucracy, which I would argue is a good idea. Another question, if there's one. I see one up here. Is that where you're going? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Harper. I'm with Fervo Energy.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yay, Fervo.
one of the things you were talking about was trust in government and surviving the pendulum of politics. I think one of the things we see, especially in energy, as a huge folly is overpromising and underdelivering. And especially that's in an election season, overpromises are what gets votes.
Yep.
And especially with the bipartisanship happening today, designing a program that'll truly stand the test of that pendulum of politics can be tricky.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that now with IRA.
Yep.
Can you give an example of a program that you've seen stand the test of time, that's been successful and that you think has promised and delivered what it said it would do?
Yeah, I mean, look, until very recently, the PEPFAR program to provide funding for AIDS treatment in Africa was something that was created under a Republican president and then preserved and expanded under Democratic presidents, right? And that largely stood the test of time. I think that as a general matter, look, I worked for Senator Warren for 7 years, and I consider myself pretty progressive. And so I was always sort of when we have an opportunity to do policy making, let's do the maximum amount that we can do with the power that we have, and let's not waste time thinking about, bringing the other party along if we have the opportunity to do it. And I've revised my view on that. I think that ultimately, and it's in part because a lot of the things that we worked on in the Biden administration are now being reversed. And it's very sad to see all these things that we worked on that I think are good for the country not go anywhere. So I think investing in the front end on bipartisanship, bipartisan process is important. It's still no guarantee that it's going to survive. But the infrastructure bill that we passed was bipartisan. And so far, you're not seeing widespread efforts to try to pull that back. IRA, even though a lot of the money goes to Republican districts, was not a bill that was passed with Republican votes. And you're seeing that it's more under threat, in part because politicians don't feel like that they are somehow invested in that piece of legislation because they didn't vote for it. Now, I think that that preference for bipartisanship where it's available shouldn't stand in the way of making progress on really important societal problems, I think. And sometimes things do persist, even though they were done, in a purely partisan way. But I think that, I can't imagine trying to operate a business that is pretty reliant on what the government is doing, because it's swinging very wildly from Trump 1 to Biden to Trump 2. And that's been my commentary about tariffs too, right? It's how do you need some amount of certainty in order to make long-term, multi-year, multi-million-dollar investments. And when government policy is swinging back and forth so significantly, it's hard to do that. And then you don't get the thing that you want because of that policy tool.
Well, and I will say that at least in the Department of Energy, we worked daily to try to insulate things from political change because of this very issue. Because of course we were trying to build things that were longer, and they were bipartisan in development. Some of those things, even though they were bipartisan in development, and we worked very hard to insulate them, have been reversed. So it's hard to know how to answer the question in this current moment, which is such a weird moment. But I will say that I am really interested lately, and it kind of comes back to China. One of the things China does that's interesting is the 5-year plan process. And it's interesting because it's a time to set priorities that then everyone refers to in policy underneath it. The closest thing to that I can think of here, interestingly, is the regional commission structure. So the regional commissions, like the Appalachian Regional Commission, exist between federal and state government. It transcends political boundaries. The leadership transcends political timelines. And some of the programs that we worked on, particularly in the coal communities context, like the energy tax adder that you heard about earlier, that I worked on, came out of that commission structure, and it had been put into it under Obama and had survived because there was state involvement, there was federal involvement, the whole structure transcended political timeframes, and it was creating these real projects on the ground that people were continually pointing to. I'm interested in more of those. Can we think about like congressionally chartered corporations where the decision making comes out of the level of politics to people who have longer time horizons in leadership? That seems really interesting to me as like a potential way forward.
Yeah, and I would just say last, and I know we're running out of time, is that I also think part of the reason for that is that political parties are more and more, at least in my lifetime, defining themselves in opposition to what the other party does, rather than as a proactive, independent vision for what they want to accomplish. And I think that's particularly true for Trump.
Just erase all the things that say Obama on them.
Right,
or whatever,
and
right?
but yeah, I think in my mind, for good reason, the Biden folks were saying we want to reverse a lot of the things that Trump did, right? Because there's a lot of baseline antipathy for Trump in the Democratic Party, and that's what it takes to move votes. And so, again, I have my critiques about abundance, but I think that one of the good things about it is that it is an attempt to present an affirmative vision for what politics should be about and what political parties can pursue. And I think that that's, in large part, the thing that we need is a politics of positivity and vision rather than just opposition to what the other party was doing, no matter how reprehensible you think it was.
Excellent, and it opens up the door to this kind of conversation, which I think is only good. So thank you, thanks so much, Bharat. Join me in thanking